Hey everyone, it's Dre DiMura here today on behalf of GuitarWorld.com, and in this lesson, I'm going to share with you 10 quick tips for improving your guitar playing. Now, the coolest thing about these tips is that they're not complex solos or theoretical concepts that you need to practice for hours and hours to get better. They're subtle, micro improvements that we can make to our technique that we can then apply to everything that we learn and play. For the beginners that are maybe struggling with intonation, bending in tune, playing bar chords and things like that, this is going to go a really long way in helping you to advance more quickly. And for the advanced players, it'll be helpful as a refresher. Some of these kind of fundamental aspects of our technique we tend to maybe neglect as we become more fluent on our instrument, and these things tend to slip a little bit or get a little lazy, so don't underestimate how helpful they might be to you as well. So let's jump right into it with tip number 1. Tip number 1 is to fret cleanly. That means placing your fretting finger directly behind the fret wire like this, as opposed to dead center like this. That might be a bit shocking if you're a beginner because it kind of makes the most logical sense to put your finger right in the center, right? But that's actually not proper fretting technique. And the reason for this is intonation, or how in tune the notes that we're playing are. So your guitar could be perfectly in tune, but the notes that we're fretting might not be. And this has everything to do with finger placement and how much pressure we're applying. When we have to press down directly in the center of the fret like this, it actually takes more force to get the note to sound clearly, which could lead to overfretting, which we'll talk about in the next tip, and the note potentially going sharp. If you fret too close to the opposite fret wire, you get this dead note or this buzzing sound. So having the finger directly behind the fret wire like this is going to give you the best result. One of my favorite ways to train this is with slides, because it gives you the added challenge of needing to slide up or down right into the correct position behind the fret wire like this. So here's an example of a lick through the pentatonic scale using proper fretting technique. So that was pretty good. It wasn't perfect, and the reason I want to stop and point that out is because I don't want you to obsess over these small details where it actually becomes a hindrance in your playing. These are things that we work on when we're practicing so that we can forget about them when we play and hope that they'll show up because we put the work in. To quote the great Joe Pass, I'm paraphrasing, but practice and then forget about it and just play. Tip number 2 builds on tip number 1, and tip number 2 is not to over fret. That's pressing down too hard on the fret and causing the note to go sharp, like this. That ain't it. It's okay if you're getting that sound, this tip will help you to correct it. This comes up for beginner guitar players a lot because the guitar has a physical learning curve. It takes some strength to press down on the frets and get the notes to sound clearly. And we tend to start overcompensating to fix things like dead notes when we're getting this kind of sound playing chords or licks. So we start pressing down even harder, trying to get those notes to ring out clearly. So what can we do to correct that? Well, what's really important is that you stay in contact with the fretboard. So I use this part of my fretting hand here to make sure that I'm staying in contact with the guitar neck here, with my thumb for support, not way back down behind the neck, not way down here behind the neck, but rather resting gently over the top of the neck while my index finger supports on the bottom of the neck. And this kind of creates a fulcrum between these two fingers. So now when I press down, I feel supported in my position. This way my muscles and body intuitively know how much pressure I need to apply to get the notes to ring clearly, versus when we have an unstable position like this, again, maybe where the thumb is way behind the fingerboard, we overcompensate because we feel like we have to apply even more pressure to get those notes to ring out. So stay relaxed and make sure that you're keeping in contact with the neck to give yourself the support and the strength that you need, that you don't need to over-apply pressure. Tip number 3 is one of my favorites, and it's consistent volume between up and down strokes. I call this one the upstroke conundrum because it pops up so often. I had a great teacher who helped me to correct this. His name was Pancho Garza. I was having difficulty with my fast alternate picking, and he diagnosed that it was because my upstrokes were significantly weaker than my downstrokes. And the reason for this is, think about it. When we start out, we're playing a lot of downstrokes. You're learning, maybe some metal riffs and playing through scales using just downstrokes. Fortunately, we can easily correct for this by playing some upstroke heavy exercises. So here's one that I like, but you can also apply this to any of the licks or riffs that you already know and practice. So this is just an A major triad played in the open position here on the highest 3 strings, and what's great about it is it uses 2 upstrokes and 1 downstroke. So we're getting that extra upstroke in there each time to help catch up. I like to use a speed burst when I play this exercise to slow it down and speed it up, push myself to play it a little faster each time. So again, you can apply this also to the riffs and licks that you're already playing. Like let's say you have a pentatonic lick you like to play, like a... Try playing that lick a few times using more upstrokes. Doing this for just a few weeks, you'll see a dramatic improvement in the consistency of your dynamics. Tip number 4 is all about finger independence and pinky strength. So this joint between the first finger and the pinky doesn't only give us the horns, it's also an incredibly strong joint that a lot of players tend to underutilize. So this, allows us to do things like this. Kind of the classic Pinky Master Paul Gilbert lick. The most basic way to train this would be to grab like the 12th and 13th frets on the high E string with the 3rd finger and then hammer on and pull off with the pinky like this. You could also practice it with picking. And then swap out the 2nd finger on the 11th fret to train that muscle memory. And if you want to take it a step further, you can begin applying it to some 3-note per string patterns. For example, in the 12th position E minor, we can play E on the 12th fret, the 2nd F sharp, and the minor 3rd G with the pinky. So we have 12, 14, 15. We can play these notes ascending. We can play them descending. We can alternate between the pinky and the 3rd finger. Then you can switch it up and use the 2nd finger like this. Another thing that really helps with this is to over-exaggerate the movement between whatever the anchor finger is and the pinky. So in the instance of the 3rd finger on the 12th fret here, I can practice just hammering on to the 13th fret with the pinky, but really over-exaggerating the movement. This is a great way to build strength. It's almost like running with ankle weights. You're using more strength than you need to in your actual playing to kind of get twice the reps in practice. Tip number 5 is for no buzz bar chords. Cheers to the editors at Guitar World for coming up with that one. I think of the Ramones or players like Billy Joe Armstrong from Green Day who, just play these beautiful full bar chords where you can hear every note ringing clearly. Bar chords can be really tricky for beginners, but I have the antidote, especially when playing the minor bar chord across all 6 strings using the E minor position. It can be really tricky to get the minor 3rd here on the G string to ring clearly. Not only is it typically muted or left out of the chord, but it actually ends up buzzing and doesn't really sound good like this. So what can we do to fix it? Well, contrary to what we talked about earlier, where I said to keep, a strong anchor on the neck with your index finger and your thumb, this is one of the only times that we actually want to bring the thumb back behind the neck. And the reason for this is because it's going to bring our first finger, which has to bar the strings, in a straight line behind the fret wire like that. Now, let me back it up and show you why you're probably having difficulty with this first. So when we learn to play open chords, right, like a G, see where my thumb is right now? I have this strong anchored position, the first finger here, playing an A chord, D chord, right? I have the thumb over the top of the neck, but if I try to apply that same position to a bar chord shape, this is all sorts of wrong. So look what's going on here. I have the thumb over the neck like this. My fingers are slanted at an angle, all right? So I can't cleanly fret across the bar. I can't even flatten this part of my first finger against the highest strings, the B and the E. So watch what happens when I bring my thumb behind the neck and straighten out my first finger like that. So this is how it sounds before and after. And if we remove the middle finger, we get the minor bar chord. So you're gonna need to increase the amount of pressure between the first finger and the thumb to ensure that you're playing that minor third note clearly in the bar, as opposed to getting the dead note like this. To check for this, try arpeggiating the chord one note at a time. So that sounds pretty good, but if you're still hearing it as a dead note, try arching your third and fourth fingers slightly, because the pinky actually might be also contributing to the G string being muted. So first, check to make sure that you have the first finger in line behind the fret wire, that you're applying the correct amount of pressure. So I'm hearing all 6 notes there. Now place the third and fourth fingers down. Up, hear that dead note? That means I need to arch my pinky slightly. There it is. To make sure the minor third rings out. And if you're really struggling with applying enough pressure for the first finger to bar across all 6 strings, try just isolating the first finger, keeping it in a straight line behind the fret wire, and then doing maybe like 5 to 10 squeezes of practicing applying that pressure without the other fingers getting in the way. Hold it and you can check by just playing straight down the strings like that to make sure you're hearing each note clearly. This next tip could be the most important one in the video, which is reducing unwanted string noise. Now, this is kind of an all hands on deck kind of operation. We need both hands to help us to mute and reduce unwanted string noise while playing. Okay, so the problem there is that I didn't use any muting at all. The only part of my hands that were in contact with the frets and the notes I was playing was just that. It was just the notes I was playing. And then I plucked the note and do you hear how much ringing and buildup there is? And I don't even have that much distortion on this tone. So this is a really important one. And we're gonna break it into 4 parts. 2 for the fretting hand and 2 for the picking hand. So let's start with the picking hand. So if you look at my picking hand here, I'm always palm muting using this part of my palm to rest against the lower string. So whenever we're playing something in the higher register, again, I'm just gonna stick in this very basic pentatonic thing. Let's say we're just playing a lick. So that lick was played on the G, the B, and the E strings, meaning I don't need the low E, A, or D in there. And because I'm gonna be resting my pick over the G string to begin the lick, I can just let the part of my palm here below the thumb just rest against those lower strings, right? As opposed to not muting at all, like this. Right, we're getting some sympathetic ringing from the other strings because as we create vibrations through the wood, the strings vibrate subtly and that gets picked up by the pickups and results in a lot of unwanted noise. So, you know, very simply, I'm just letting my palm rest against the strings like this, resting my pick on the G string. And now this is doing all the work of muting these lower strings while I play a lick in the higher register. Now the second part of this with the picking hand is using the upper fingers to mute higher strings when you're playing something in the lower registers. So something like this. So there, when I was doing like the low register muted riffing thing, I was letting the edge of my pinky on my picking hand rest against the high E strings, sometimes even my third finger rests against the B strings, kind of lazily. It doesn't need to be like super rigid or anything, but it is helping reduce any unwanted high register string noise there. Now let's look at what we can do with the fretting hand. So the first thing is to use this area of the fretting fingers here to rest against the higher strings whenever you're playing a passage or a chord. So for example, if we were to go, if you look closely, I'm being very economical with my movement. I'm letting the underside of my fretting fingers rest against the higher strings to keep them from ringing like this. This is supported by that strong hand placement that we talked about in tip number 1. And what's cool here is the first finger is actually doing a lot of the work. Even when I fret on the 9th fret with the 3rd finger, I'm still using the underside of the 1st finger to mute the high B and E strings. Now this final one might be the most helpful, which is having the tip of your fretting finger mute the next lowest string. So if I were to play something like this on the G string, if you look really closely, what I'm actually doing is the tip of my first finger is resting against the D string, helping to mute it so that when I strike the strings, even like with force, I'm just getting that clear D note right there. If I didn't do this, this is how that would sound. So now you're getting that open string in there. And again, the first finger, when you have it anchored here, can do a lot of the work. Even when I fret with the 3rd finger, the first finger is still muting against the D string. This even applies to things like slides. If you look closely, you can see the tip of my first finger is in contact with the D string, helping to mute it. It doesn't have to stay in contact with the string the whole time. Like you'll notice there that I did vibrato. But now look at my right hand. Now I'm combining the right hand palm muting on the low strings so that I have the freedom to move my first finger to do the vibrato without getting the D string in there. Super clean. So if I didn't do any of that, this is how that would sound. Tip number 7 is bending in tune. This is a big one for beginners, again, because of the physical learning curve of developing the technique to play the electric guitar especially. It takes strength to bend the notes. So they usually come up kind of flat when you're starting out, like. There's a really easy way to fix this, so check it out. The trick is, while we are bending with our 3rd finger, we're not just bending with our 3rd finger. We're not doing this. I got nothing to support me there. There's no additional strength. Now, because the cutoff point for whatever note you're playing on one of the strings is the highest note you're fretting, right? Like right here, I'm fretting the 11th fret on the B string. Anything I do behind the 11th fret doesn't affect the sound. So I can rest, my other fingers there, the first finger, the second finger, again, strong position with the thumb and the first finger in contact with the bottom of the fingerboard, and look what happens. So now I have the added strength, the additional support of the first and second fingers helping me to make sure I'm getting that bend up to pitch. To check for this, we want to actually play the note we're bending to first to practice it. Do this like, maybe 10 times in a row. So in this case, I'm bending a whole step up to the 13th fret. So go ahead and play the 13th fret and then bend 11 up to match. Vibrato also always helps. But if you want an added challenge when you're practicing this specifically, try not to add vibrato so that you really have to be accurate. Another cool exercise for this is to bend a half step, then a whole step like this. This helps to train the muscle memory of knowing how far you need to bend to hit each pitch. And you can even apply that same exercise to like an entire scale. One more quick tip here is that you're not just originating the bend from the 3rd finger either. You're kind of using this part of the hand and the wrist to scoop into the bend. So like imagine there's like a curved arrow here and that the energy is kind of originating from back here and it's bringing me through the bend. So as opposed to say like a straight line where you're still putting a lot of pressure on the third finger to do all the work. So kind of scooping in and up to achieve the bend and get it strongly in tune. Tip number 8 is about the dynamics between our picking and legato playing. So making sure that the volume of our hammer-ons and pull-offs matches that of our plucked notes. Now, the problem typically isn't your picking, it's the strength of your legato movements. So we want to isolate that and just work on that and then recombine them. A big thing that you can do to work on this, like I mentioned earlier, is over-exaggerating the movement. If we take just like a very basic hammer-on, like say on the G string between 7 and 9, I'm plucking that first note, and then I'm striking the next note with my fretting hand really hard. See, I'm kind of winding up through my elbow into my wrist. It's almost like this pendulum swinging back and forth on the fretting hand, and I'm trying to get the volume of that hammered note to match the note that I picked. And then you also want to do this in reverse for the pull-off. Again, really exaggerating the flick away, the pull-off. We're trying to train a muscle. Also remember the muting from a few tips ago? I am employing that here to make sure that we're not getting any crazy ringing from the B and E strings in this case. I'm letting this part below the knuckle on my fretting finger mute those strings. And I'm using my palm to mute the low strings when I do the hammer-on. You should practice this for all of your fingers and positions. And then try applying it to a real-world application like, some kind of lick. You can also try alternating between plucking both notes and then doing the hammer-on or the pull-off like this. The ultimate goal is that we can combine legato with picking to create super smooth, fluid runs like Joe Satriani or Eddie Van Halen. Tip number 9 is to use a wide dynamic range. Not everything is always played at one volume, right? The player that comes to mind for me is Eric Johnson. He's got such a breadth of tones that he can create just with, how he plays, how he attacks the strings, but also controlling the volume and tone controls on his guitar. A great way to practice this is to take a short repeating phrase or passage and practice playing it all the way from a very quiet dynamic up to a louder dynamic, and being conscious of how you're coming into contact with the strings. Using a light touch with your fretting hand. As things get louder, I'm starting to angle my pick a bit. Digging in a little more forcefully. And as it's getting louder and louder, now I'm starting to really change the way that I attack the strings with my picking hand. And this is where that muting that we talked about earlier will also come in handy, helping you to control noise as you begin to increase the dynamics and get even louder. Players that are really elite with this, that come to mind for me, are like Jimmy Page. John Mayer is really good at going from something that's a lot more delicate with their touch to something more bombastic and aggressive during a solo, like... Finally, make sure your guitar is properly in tune and intonated. Tuning, obviously very important. If you had to only ever have one pedal, it should be a tuning pedal. Now, what you'll want to look out for here is that, again, like I mentioned in the very beginning, your guitar might be in tune, but it might not be intonated properly. While this does have a lot to do with how we, approach the guitar, how much pressure we're applying in our hand position and stuff, the guitar itself needs to be properly set up. So you can take it to like a local music shop or a luthier, someone nearby who can, set up the guitar in your town or city, or you can learn to do it yourself. There's plenty of videos online. You just need a couple simple tools to make sure the guitar is properly in tune and intonated, which has a lot more to do with how the saddles here are set up on the bridge and also the truss rod in the neck, which I don't want to endorse altering on your own unless you begin to get some experience servicing guitars, because it can cause some warping in your neck. So just make sure that you proceed with caution if you're going to do anything major to your guitar. But as far as checking intonation, a good way to double check is to grab a tuner, clip on, you can use an app, tune the guitar, play the open string, and then check that against the tuning of the harmonic on the 12th fret. Or if you're not doing harmonics yet, you can even just press down on the 12th fret and check the tuning there. And what you might find is that it's a little bit flat or sharp of the perfectly in tune open string. That's your intonation there. So a little bit of intonation variance isn't going to sound terrible, but a whole lot of it will make it difficult, especially when you're playing chords or double stops, triads, things like that, multiple notes at the same time in the higher register. This guitar is actually due for a setup and needs to be intonated, so I can show you an example. If I play this C major bar chord here on the 5th string, then move that up an octave, you can hear some of those notes, especially here on the B string, that are quite a bit sharp. So that's an important tip for beginning to improve the sound and the tone of your instrument in a big way. And that's all 10 tips. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to GuitarWorld.com.